Hey guys, it's Miss Dark. I just wanted to talk with you a little bit about writing an introduction to a narrative, though a lot of this is applicable to any kind of paper. So introductions are the first paragraph of a paper, and they introduce the narrator, the characters, and the setting of the story. So all of that background information goes into the introduction. And there's basically three parts to an introduction. You have your hook, your lead, and your thesis. So for your hook, your lead, and your thesis, there's basically different kinds of hooks that you can have. And let's start there. So the first line or two of an introduction is your hook. And the hook is the part of the introduction where you grab the reader's attention and pull them into your story. So a hook, there can be different devices you can use to grab your reader's attention. A common one that you might see is onomatopoeia, which is an onomatopoeia is effectively words whose sounds suggest their meaning. So words like buzz, bang, sometimes what you would call like a sound effect type word, like those are all onomatopoeia, and you can start with a sound effect, which would be a way to grab your reader. Because if the very first line in your story is bang, that's going to grab your reader's attention because you're like, okay, what happened? Was it a gun? Did someone slam a door? What's going on, right? And that'll grab the reader's attention. You can start with dialogue, which is the words that are being said by characters in a story. And that can often immediately grab a reader because it puts them directly into what's the action of what's happening in that story at the time. So dialogue, here, could you repeat that? I'm going to model an introduction here in a minute using a prompt, and let's pretend that my prompt is something that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed about your life, something that is different in your life because of the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? And I'm going to tell a story about how, because I'm hard of hearing, I'm having difficulty with not being able to read people's lips. And that's going to be what I say has changed because of that. So we're going to come down to that when we get to thesis, but that's kind of what these different hooks are getting at, is different ways that I could start my story and grab my reader's attention based on what I know my story is going to be about. So if I have, what I know my intro and all of these, I've done my pre-writing, I've got my plot diagram of the story I'm going to tell, I can use that information to decide what kind of device I want to start, because I know from my exposition in my plot diagram exactly where I want to start my story. So if I know that moment, I can use that to kind of decide what kind of hook might work for me. Do I want to do onomatopoeia? Do I want to start with some dialogue? A lot of times you can also use a question. So you can start your story with a question. I would just be careful to keep your point of view the same. So make sure not to use you unless you are writing your entire story in second person, which is pretty unlikely unless you're writing a choose-your-own-adventure style story. So if you're writing in first person, I, me, my, or third person, he, she, they, you don't want to use you when you write that question. So you could start with a question, though. You could say, why are restaurants always so loud, right? And that still gets your reader thinking. It still gets them wondering, that's a good question. Well, maybe it's because of this, or maybe it's because of that, right? And you go on from that point. You could start with really zoning in and giving a lot of detail about the setting of your story. Since your introduction needs to introduce your setting anyway, a good way to do that might be to put a lot of setting information. The coffee shop was bustling, people were talking, and coffee percolating. That puts your reader immediately into the scene that you are creating and drops them immediately into the story. Kind of like with dialogue, it creates that immediate sense of bringing them in. So that could be a hook. You see that a lot with it was a dark, stormy night type style of introduction. You can start with a snapshot or kind of an in media res type of situation where you immediately drop them into the middle of something that's going on, and that grabs their attention with the action in the scene. That could be a way of grabbing your reader's attention. An in media res story starts in the middle of the action, which can kind of grab your reader. Okay, and some of these have some overlap. You notice my dialogue here was a question. You notice that the setting situation, some of these issues are kind of that same snapshot in media res situation. Okay, so an example I put here was the barista frowned at me, eyebrows pulling down. Again, you're in the middle of this scene, right? Let's drop you in the middle. Let's start the snapshot. Let's start in the middle of the action. Why is the barista frowning? What happened? It gets the reader questioning. Okay. You could also start with a fact. Statistics and facts make for a good hook, because the reader will go, "Oh, I didn't know that," or "Really?" Or they might have a reaction to that. So if I start with lip reading is only about 30% accurate, which I know because I found a credible source for my source when I was looking for this information from the Georgia Tech Research Institute. I could start with that fact, and you're probably going to want to put that when we get into like in-text citation stuff, you're going to put this in properly and go through all of that. But it's important to know that when you're getting a fact or a statistic, that you're finding good, solid information for this if you're using this kind of hook. You don't want to be putting false information out there. So, facts. Lip reading is about 30% accurate. And all of these are different hooks that I could use for my particular story that would grab my reader's attention. So the one that I started with was the fact, okay? So you start with getting your hook and figuring out how you're going to start your story. You're going to work out of order here and kind of come up with your thesis. So the thesis is one sentence that explains all of what your story is going to be about. And you're like, a thesis in a narrative? But yes, you can have a thesis in a narrative, because you're still just putting one sentence that talks about what you're going to be going through, like one sentence that sums up what your story is about, that kind of hits home that information. So you still want to have a thesis of sorts in your narrative, okay? So for my narrative, this thesis is going to be, the COVID-19 pandemic made me more aware of my hearing loss. It's still what this story is about, even though it's not leaving that kind of preview of information in a typical way that you might normally see in a thesis sentence. Okay, so the lead, which I have here in purple, is effectively a sentence or more that connects your hook to your thesis. How do you get from here to there? Well, you need to create sentences that smoothly create that paragraph and get us from what is grabbing the reader's attention to what you're actually going to talk about. Sometimes this is relatively short, sometimes this is rather long. And either way is fine, okay? So, either way of this is fine as long as you're getting there, okay? So, let's say that I am putting here, I'm starting with my hook. Lip reading is about 30% accurate. This was 30% of help that I needed. I would just have to make do. I took a deep breath and walked into the cafe. I tried my best to be vigilant and catch everything going on around me. And then I could go on and maybe give some of that information about the setting. I looked over the barista, assaulted by the smell of coffee and the clamor of people around me. How am I going to hook this from here to there? Well, I'm probably going to talk about the situation that I was in that made lip reading something that would have helped me. A situation where I knew I was going to be more aware of my hearing loss. Why? Because people are wearing masks, right? So, if I'm going to talk about this, I need to put that purple information. So you get from red to purple to blue. And red and blue are two totally different colors, so you need that purple in the middle there to kind of get you there. Okay? So, I could go on here and talk about that. So, we have our red, have our hook that's grabbing our reader's attention. We have our purple here that is connecting the two ideas. Because you don't want it to be a sharp change. Everything that you're writing in a story needs to everything you're writing in the story needs to be able to go smoothly from one idea to the other. you don't want any sharp breaks. Everything needs to go relatively smooth. You need to have those transitions. You need to kind of go from idea to idea in a smooth, normal way that isn't going to be in any way jolting to the reader of the story that you are writing. So everything that you're doing here needs to go smoothly. And the idea is that it is an overall paragraph. I mean, in an edit, you can go back and in edits and make this smoother and add more to your lead if you need to, kind of get from point A to point B in a smooth way. But it's important that it's a smooth transition. So you need to have this purple, okay? You might be like, I already got hook, I got my reader's attention, I already talked about what I'm going to talk about. Do I really need a lead? Yes, you really need a lead, okay? So you've got your red, you got the purple to kind of get you there, and then you talk about what you're going to talk about. And again, you do need still a thesis statement when you are writing a narrative, because otherwise people aren't going to know what they're getting into when they sit down to read your story, okay? And it doesn't have to be a big thing, and it doesn't have to sound super clinical, you know? So, again, just kind of modeling for you guys what you're kind of looking for and going through when you are writing an introduction to a narrative, but also any kind of paper that you might have to write. So, hopefully this has helped. Hopefully you kind of feel confident on what you need to have in an introduction, how an introduction works, and what to look for. So you have your thesis, you have your hook, you have your lead. So hopefully this helps. Have an awesome day.